Good afternoon and welcome to this session. It's great to be with you all. I'm sorry I can't be in person with you all, but such is life these days. And we have a great panel to talk about the challenges of the last year and perspectives on the future of higher education. Think about how significant a year this has been. We have had COVID crisis. We have had a new president of the United States. And that may be, it's kind of odd to think about because people have already, I think, started not to remember what it was like to wake up in the Trump administration and really having to check the newspapers every day about what they were up to. It really is a dramatic change. And for higher ed, it's been a dramatic change. So we have three excellent panelists to talk about these issues with today. And we're going to start with Dan Greenstein of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. You saw all of their bios before. We're also going to talk to Susan Poser, who is currently at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she is provost, but this summer will become president of Hofstra University. And also with Millie Garcia, president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. So Dan, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you to explain what's been going on with your plans to consolidate 6 of the campuses. You are very much in the news, and I wonder if you could tell us why.
This must be interesting to a small group of people. So no, thanks for the question. Thanks for being here. Congratulations, Susan. Nice to see you all. So let me just a quick overview of what integration is. So obviously looking at 2 groups of 3 of our universities, bringing them together as a single accredited entity. And the rationale is really to address a longstanding set of issues, part of a sort of a more general structural change, a transformational change of the Pennsylvania state system to sort of align our operating with kind of new needs and interests of students, employers, but also our new enrollment realities, which are very different than they were even a decade ago. And one of the things we're seeing in our universities and some of our universities elsewhere is that as enrollments decline, and we've lost 20% overall, some of them between 40 and 50% since 2010, is that eventually you contract. You can only sustain as many programs as you can enroll students in and afford, and 75% of our revenues come from students' tuition, fees, room and board. So as universities contract their programming, well, then they become less attractive to their students. And they also, begin to, these are regional universities. They're what ASCU called stewards of place, right? They're fundamental to rural parts of our state. And so they're relied upon to create the business leaders, the healthcare professionals, the educators that those communities need, right? And so those communities require comprehensive universities. They require their universities to be more comprehensive than they can afford based on their enrollments and state funding. So integration allows us to operate those universities in a financially sustainable way to address their enrollment realities, while at the same time ensuring that they maintain the breadth of programmatic breadth with minimal reliance on hybrid and online forms of instruction. So that's the goal: is you get the best of both worlds. You can have traditional residential, right? So the other thing, so that was the sort of driver behind integration. Plans were done very transparently, like by working groups with 1,000 people from those institutions is part of a process defined in statute. Very transparent. So the plans are on the web, which is like, you're kidding me, really, in higher education, but it's a good thing, right? It's generating a lot of passionate comment. I think that's arguably where the news media is sourcing its interest, and that's a good thing. People should care about the future, and this Pennsylvania public higher education system is part of the future of the state. These changes, I think, absent making them, the state is going to be, seriously harmed in terms of having the ability to drive its economy and to ensure pathways of social mobility. I know Millie's going to be talking about the Values Commission report. It's directly responsive to those challenges. It's hard. Change is hard. Super hard. Don't try it, is my advice, if you can get away with it. But it's also necessary. And it's about our students, and it's about our future. So who cares if it's hard? Couple top lines, I'll shut up. I would say things that I've learned, right? This kind of change, this level of change, it's really personal. I mean, our university is the youngest, is like 127 years old. This stuff runs deep, and it should. And so you see the kind of prospect of this transformational change eliciting, often in the same body, tremendous exhilaration and sense of opportunity. You see that in the plans, using the plans as an opportunity to redesign our universities around our students, not to shoehorn them into constructs that we built over the last 50 years. It generates tremendous skepticism, which is healthy. Hey, is this really going to work? Let's think about it. And it generates anger and grief and loss. And all of those emotions are real. And the question I think we face is, how do we surround all our faculty, staff, student, community members, alumni with the supports they need to help them along this journey? So I think you're seeing some of that in the press. I think you're seeing, change at this level in a public sector requires bipartisan support. In a swing state, with a General Assembly, which is tipped to the Republicans, and an executive branch, which is tipped to the Democrats. And bipartisan support is hard to find, but if we're going to find it, we can probably find it around education and workforce development, because people care that much. And I think that's important. And education requires, this kind of transformation requires investment. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is we maybe left it a little late. We'll get it done one way or the other, something will happen, whether this plan is accepted or not, But my advice, if you're going to pivot with cash in the bank. Because when you don't have cash in the bank, the margin, the room for maneuver is really limited. So it requires, and it should require investment. But all of these things, I think, are generating, a really important conversation around Pennsylvania in all quarters and regions and constituents. And it's exactly the kind of conversation that, from a policy perspective, you want people to have. It's about our future and how to get there and what level of investment we need in order to get there. So I'm inspired by it. Not every day is great and not every hour is fun, but the mission is super important. And win, lose, or draw, we're going to learn a heck of a lot, and it's there on the web for anybody who wants to borrow from it. And I hope they do.
So how many jobs will be lost? I've seen figures that get pretty high.
So they're wrong. So the job loss is occasioned by the fact that, we're just losing enrollments, and in order to sustain our, independently of consolidation, we cannot keep operating in a way, that draws down on scarce reserves that are available to the system. We're structured, we're a single bank account. So any university in the system which is financially challenged basically reflects those financial challenges on the other universities. And what's happening is that through a variety of cross-subsidization and loans to universities that are struggling, we're beginning to pull all the others down too. That's what's happening. And it is a consequence of our enrollment declines and our, challenges with respect to state support, the demographic trends that we're all aware of. All that stuff is showing up in our finances. So we have to address it independently of whether we integrate. We are going to address that. And those job loss, about 13% overall faculty and staff, independent of integration. That is happening. Whether integration goes forward or not, you'll see that kind of job loss. Integration is about ensuring that job loss stops. Because if we get into that vicious cycle where declining enrollments generate cuts, which then promulgate more declining enrollments, that's not a very pretty picture. And we can get out of it because we're a system. We have the opportunity for universities to club together, and by clubbing together, ensure each of them has program breadth. Their students, no matter where they are, have access to the full breadth of programs that they need. So I think we can escape that vicious cycle that would be harder to escape if we were operating independently of one another.
And how much of this is being forced by Penn State? Penn State set up these branch campuses all over the state that weren't originally all over the state. Are they contributing to the problem?
So, this problem is complicated, and I think a lot of people will look for, the bogeyman or person, and we can find it in a lot of places. I tend to not do that. Higher education is very crowded in Pennsylvania, as it is in other states up in the sort of mid-Atlantic, Northeast, Western Midwest part of the country. Our demographic trends have been unfavorable. Our level of state investment has been unfavorable. The absence of real kind of master planning at the state level has been, a contributing factor. Just a whole bunch of stuff going on. But at the end of the day, I think what's happened in Pennsylvania as elsewhere is that the price is going up. And so I think, our net average price cost of attendance for a student is, I don't know, $22,000, $23,000. That's a lot. I mean, Pennsylvania, we're third most expensive or something in the country, 47th or 48th in terms of state investment. Those numbers are kind of related. And so students will at that price point find other options. So we've got to somehow, and that is related to all of those other, structural. If I was emperor and not chancellor, I would probably address this through a kind of combined ground up, top down policy approach, where you end up with a kind of more coordinated approach to the allocation of state dollars. But that's not about Penn State or Pitt or Temple or Pennsylvania State System or community colleges. That's really about bringing our sort of higher education public policy regime into the 21st century and aligning it to the kind of goals that I know we're going to be talking about with Millie around equity and mobility and workforce, frankly. That's something that needs to happen, not just in Pennsylvania.
So thank you very much. And we're going to come back to you. I want to remind the audience, you can ask questions through the chat box that you should see. Please feel free to ask questions. And after we talk to our other panelists, I will get to them. So Susan, I mentioned the issue of COVID. I wonder if you could tell me, how did you handle it at UIC? And what can we learn from your experience at UIC?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and I appreciate the invitation to join this panel. So let me say a few things about University of Illinois Chicago, UIC, just so that everybody understands what we are. We're a public urban Carnegie Research One university with about 400 million in research expenditures this year. We have a very big campus on the West Loop in Chicago with a health sciences campus about a mile west of there, and it's connected by a street with retail and restaurants and so on. It's actually what's left of Little Italy in Chicago. We've got about 33,000 students. We have no ethnic majority among the undergraduate population at UIC. And so I like to say that UIC looks like America is going to look in about 20 years. And what higher ed will look like, I think, well before that. And about 55% of our students are Pell eligible, about 40% are first generation, and about 85% are commuter students. So that's the background about UIC. We came through, I think, very well. We, of course, shut down like everybody else did in the spring. In fall 2020, we had a small number of classes on campus for undergraduates, mostly laboratory classes, theater, music. We kept the residence halls open the whole time from the very beginning, and we had about 800 to 1,000 students in them this academic year, instead of the usual about 3,500. We reopened research in June of 2020, so we were able to bring faculty and graduate students back at that time, slowly, distanced, and so forth. And of course, the health side of the campus stayed open. We have 7 health sciences colleges, and I think it's the second largest medical school in the country, and a hospital that is a UIC hospital. And so we, moved a lot of the clinics out to make space for COVID patients. And so that, of course, lost a lot of money for the medical school and the whole health sciences enterprise. So that's kind of a really quick picture of it. I was, of course, focused on the academic side. And so the immediate issue, like everywhere, was just getting through spring 2020 and addressing certain requests that were coming up, like extending the tenure clock for assistant professors, which we did, and class evaluations of faculty, which we agreed in the spring 2020. Faculty did not have to include their evaluations in their dossiers for P&T. New grading policy for students. Again, we eliminated the D, we made it a credit, we made the F and no credit. I had a lot of contact with the Senate and the Senate leaders. We have a good relationship with the Senate, and a nice indication of that was not too far into this emergency, the Senate passed a resolution that allowed the administration to bypass most of the processes of shared governance, which allowed us to be very nimble in bringing up new policies quickly. And we were able to make quick decisions just by consulting the Senate and the unions. But the Senate did not insist on extensive deliberations with them as they usually would for major things like tenure rollbacks and that sort of thing. We also had about, I think, a little over 20 impact bargaining sessions with the union starting in April of 2020. But I quickly turned my attention to the fall, last spring, I quickly turned my attention to what were we going to do in fall 2020 to reopen or open or, deliver the curriculum at UIC. And we had to figure this out for a low-income commuter population, many of whom would be living at home, many of whom would be in multi-generational households, where they might have responsibilities for members of their families, including younger siblings who might themselves be learning remotely. And they also might be suffering from inadequate Wi-Fi and hardware. And many of our students also work, and they might be working even more if their parents or whoever they were living with lost their own jobs. And so to think about this very complicated issue, I created something called the Fall 2020 Academic Planning Task Force, which had about 25 faculty and staff and administrators on it. And we broke into 3 subcommittees to recommend, first of all, how to support on-campus classes to the extent we would have them last fall, how to support online classes, and then also the third subcommittee spent a lot of time running focus groups and doing surveys in order to get student perspective on this issue. And then after a lot of consideration there, I made a very controversial decision, which was I required that all classes that had over 70 students in them, not only would they be remote, the vast majority of our classes were remote, but classes that had more than 70 students in them would have to be asynchronous. They would have to be taught asynchronously instead of synchronously. And we had about 450 classes that had over 70 students enrolled. So you might say, why did I do this? And how did I get away with it? I did it because this is what the students needed. I knew that our student body, given where they come from and the demographics, they simply would not be able to sit down at an appointed time, 4 or 5 times a week, times 3, right? If it was a class that met 3 times a week, for a synchronous class. I also, it was made very clear to me that the faculty would not agree on a policy that required they record their classes. They felt that that was an invasion not only for themselves, but possibly for the students who might be participating in class. So I couldn't just say, teach however you want and everything will be recorded, and then if the student can't attend, they can watch it later. That wasn't a possibility. And I knew that the students would need other kinds of flexibility at the time, because again, of their living situations, and probably because more of them were going to be having to work, and who knows at what hours. The other, of course, added benefit of this is that it would expand the possibilities for course delivery after COVID. And that we would have a highly skilled faculty that knew how to do both synchronous and asynchronous. So this decision, of course, generated some controversy, but in the end, the faculty agreed and went along with it. And we provided a lot of support. Every faculty member who was going to teach asynchronous, a class, an online class about how to teach online asynchronously was available to them. And that we had about 650 people take that class. So it was even more than the 450 who were teaching, because of course it's a completely different way of organizing and structuring a class when it's taught asynchronously. We provided every faculty member teaching asynchronously what we call the course builder, which was a graduate assistant who also took the class about how to teach asynchronously and then helped the faculty member put their class together. We had lots and lots of resources on the website. We had faculty who knew how to do this already volunteered to be mentors to faculty who were learning. And I was even able to get some money from the system office at the University of Illinois so that I could provide a small payment, it was about $2,500 to each of these faculty members that was going through this work of preparing to teach asynchronously. And finally, we did ensure that the faculty owned all of the IP that they created. Ordinarily, if they created these classes, especially if they were paid something for it, we would have the right to license them, the university would. But we essentially interpreted our statutes differently and essentially waived that right. so that we had absolutely no ownership or licensing rights to these classes that they created. And that brought the anxiety level down a lot. So that was sort of the big thing. We were very fortunate to have saliva testing starting in the fall, and this was something developed by scientists at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And so we have been doing that the whole time. We're now vaccinating everybody through our health sciences colleges. So I could say more about our plans for the fall. We are going to be open. Classes over 100 are going to be taught remotely. And we are putting technology in all the classes, thanks to the HERF Acts and the Rescue Act is going to be able to pay for that. And so there's a bunch of other things that we're doing. I'm just going to skip ahead to talk a little bit about the future, because I think that's what's really interesting here. So everybody in higher ed now has the opportunity to take what we've learned about remote learning, but also about our remote existence. And once we have choice, and I would really consider this coming academic year a transitional year where we're not going to have total choice, although we're going to, it seems more and more that we're going to have a lot of choice. How are we going to use all of, of what we learned, not only in curriculum delivery, which is the most important, but also in how faculty run office hours, how we run conferences, how we run meetings, and the extent to which we're going to be live or remote. And so coming from a school that is mostly commuter, mostly low income, very, very diverse, we have an opportunity to tailor the curriculum delivery to our particular kinds of students, which I think will look quite different from how a more residential, suburban or rural school like Urbana-Champaign, for example, our sister school, how they're going to tailor their curriculum delivery. And so I think that that's a very exciting prospect. At UIC, we know most of our students work. We know most of them commute. And what can we do to tailor our curriculum delivery around that? I think the important things are going to be listening to the students, which we're already beginning to do through various mechanisms. And I think a challenge is going to be balancing what the faculty want to do under these circumstances and the staff with what the students may need. And I think that's going to be a big challenge going forward. And one thing I did not address, of course, was the other major pandemic that we had, which was the racial injustice that we saw and the sort of racial reckoning that brought on. And I think that that's also going to, although we, and I know most universities did many things to address this over the course of the past year, I think it's going to come roaring back once everybody is together on campus, and we have to be prepared for that. And so I'm looking forward very much to Millie's talk.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up on one thing. I'm very interested in that the faculty agreed to not hold you to the shared governance standards. I wonder if you could talk about that a little more, because obviously you care about shared governance, but you didn't do some things.
Well, the only way I can explain it is that we just had some very good relationships with the leaders of the Senate and with the Senate. And those were developed over the years. I guess for me, it was about the 4 years prior to COVID. Our chancellor has been at UIC one more year than I have, so about 5 years. And I meet with the Senate leaders all the time. I'm on a easy relationship with them and talk to them. If I just have a question, I'll email them and talk to them. I appear in the Senate for every meeting, of course. I meet with the Senate Executive Committee, I think about once a month. So we had developed very good relationships with them, very open relationships. And UIC, this is true of some schools and not of others. UIC has a Senate that has some of our very, very best faculty in it. And they are very interested in collaborative relationship. And so it was really something that I walked into. I didn't create the Senate, obviously, and was very happy to collaborate with them for those years. So I think the answer is just that we had developed the trust. They could see the crisis that they were in. They wanted a lot of things, like the faculty rollbacks and faculty evaluation changes, grading changes. And so we consulted with them, but we didn't have to go through all of this. And if they didn't like something, they made that known.
I'm sure they did. Millie, you have been also very much in the news lately with the release of the Gates Commission's report. You co-led the panel that produced the report. Wonder if you could please talk about that.
Sure. First of all, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Well, the Gates Foundation started this commission, the Post-Secondary Value Commission. Quite frankly, began before COVID. I think it was visionary. It's what we spent 2 years thinking about examining the role of post-secondary education and how it can and should provide opportunity, paving an equitable path to economic mobility and dismantling what we saw in the last couple of years, right? The racism, the sexism, the classism, and quite frankly, the threat on democracy with the insurrection. So we weren't just talking to ourselves. It was comprised of about 30 people from all sectors that included professors, union representatives, administrators, nonprofit organizations, the media, national higher ed organizations, four-year institutions. And it also was supported by a group of 35 researchers in a task force that provided the research and data for us to work on the report. The report provides a framework and it aims to ensure that our campuses are serving as engines of mobility, especially for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, underrepresented AAPI, which we don't really talk about too much, students from low income backgrounds, and women. And we were responsible for producing three things: a conceptual definition of post-secondary value and core principles, and that was to guide our institutions for improvement, and also policy conversations about equitably increasing economic success and mobility. And so let me give you that. I'm going to read the definition so I have it right. And it says, students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. The core principles, we know what they are, but I'm going to say them. Equity matters. Institutions and programs matter. Policy matters, as we've seen with all the money coming from the federal government, helping our institutions. Public returns and investment matter, and measuring value matters. So that was one of the things that we did. It also a framework on how to gauge how specific institutions and programs create value for students. And there it measures the value that a student experiences from attending our colleges by examining the difference between the investment they make and the estimated economic and non-economic returns they receive beyond what they would have experienced otherwise without that credential. It includes a series of economic value thresholds that measures whether students experience different economic returns over time. And then an action agenda with recommendations for applying the definition and framework. That's extremely important. We know about all these reports we put on the shelf, and it's so important that we have an action agenda to encourage the widespread application of the value definition and framework to spur action, call to action that delivers more equitable value to our students. It's not exhaustive. As a matter of fact, ASCU, that represents approximately 400 regional comprehensive institutions, DAN's system being part of our organization, is having a webinar to talk about the report and the recommendations to see what's missing and what's going to be ASCU's institutions calls for action on the 18th. We realize that institutional leaders, and this is for the future, right? Institutional leaders, regardless if you're in the administration, you're an academic senate chair, you're a leader on your campus, you have power, but also the responsibility for increasing college and program access and completion for the underserved that we all know we haven't done a great job in educating, in graduating, and helping them into economic mobility and economic security. So there are recommendations for institutional leaders, for example, reduce barriers to enrollment for transfer students. I can't believe that's still an issue. That was an issue when I was a young faculty member in CUNY. I was on their task force, still an issue. And I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was. Implement best practices in equitable recruitment and develop robust partnership with schools. There was a great report this morning inside Higher Ed about how some institutions do not have that really relationship with schools in the neighborhood that serve the underserved. Federal policymakers, and we see those recommendations, and we see that there's a move and a push for doubling Pell, that there's a move and a push for federal state partnership to stabilize and secure state and federal funding. And we also see the money that's coming in that's sending institutions money for exceptional students, these students who are exceptionally in need. And so we see some really coordination there. And then state policymakers to develop or refocus statewide attainment goals to promote mobility and equitable value. You saw that big report that came out of California. I was on one of the commissions that worked on that report. So states are now starting to look at that as well. We have a lot of work to do. As Susan said, this is about the future and how we take this at this crucible moment, this amazing moment where we see the changing demographic and the new majority of America that's going to affect not only those students that graduate, but also our cities, our state, and our nation in lifting up.
So Millie, when I wrote about the report, one reaction I got that was very interesting was, well, what about Harvard? And, and people want to talk about the elites, and the report generally doesn't want to focus on them. And I mean, it welcomes their help, but it says that's not where the action is. Could you talk about that?
I think we need to look at who's the new majority of America, where they are attending schools, and who is going to be in need to fill in the careers that are coming up that we all know needs a post-secondary degree, number one. Number two, we're going to need to ensure that this new majority understands democracy and is voting and being engaged. We know that when we educate people who will be the new majority, they'll be voting, they'll be better educated, they will have less health, there'll be less incarceration, etc. So if Harvard wants to admit those students, that's absolutely wonderful. But we know that those students that come from the upper socioeconomic status, that 1%, they're going to be successful in spite of Harvard. And yet the students that Susan and Dan are educating in the ASCU institutions, they will be successful because of everything these institutions, faculty, and staff are doing to educate them. And so we have to put the emphasis on who's the new majority of America and where are they.
And does that include the money? You talk about the emphasis, but what about the money that goes for research, philanthropy, et cetera?
So that's where we have to start working, right? So advocating with the federal government, and I am very pleased with what's coming out of the White House and Department of Ed right now. It's very different from when I first came to ASCU 3 years ago. That's number one. Number two, we see states starting to recognize that the vitality of the state, like California, like what Dan is doing, will depend on how do we support these institutions. We see foundations like Gates saying we're supportive of what's in this report, and we're really ready to put our resources behind it. And so people are starting to realize that this is about the country and it's about democracy.
So we can have a question from our audience, and I'd like to invite the audience to submit more questions through the chat function. But this question is, can the panelists please speak to how non-faculty staff members' input and needs have been considered on their campuses, perhaps as complements to faculty input needs? And I'd ask Millie to talk about your campuses, not a campus. Anyone want to take that question?
I mean, I can start, Scott, if it makes sense.
Sure.
In the integration work, that work with the planning work was done by working groups drawn from staff and faculty at the universities. And there was about 1,000 overall people who were involved in it, 300 of which were faculty, which means 700 were staff. So, I mean, I think we take shared governance to that sort of broader level so that it includes students and staff and faculty and trustees of our universities and et cetera. It's absolutely critical. And especially, I mean, I don't want to touch on Susan's topic, but, with the pandemic, the impacts on staff and faculty were actually often orthogonal. And so, there you are as a leader trying to, so to balance constituent needs, which were really different. I mean, where faculty would maybe want more remote, staff are especially in facilities and student facing services is like, if the students aren't here, what am I going to do? It was a very complex set of issues. So I think, to the point that maybe Susan raised, I think these experiences of transformational change will be good for our shared governance because they'll force us to do it in a more efficient way, more quickly, to communicate more, but I think maybe more broadly too. So I want to be hopeful about that.
Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that that the needs were very different in many cases, because of course we also have a lot of staff who are frontline workers, and they had to be there in our case, if only to support the students that we let stay on campus because they had to. They really didn't have much choice, or it was a better place for them to stay. But also because we have this whole health sciences part of the campus, and everything had to keep going, from parking to cleaning to everything else. And so I think in that sense, yes, the needs were very different. In other senses, they were very similar. I mean, our staff have little children at home just the way our faculty do. And so in that sense, some of the policies were able to easily cover both sides. Our Senate does have staff in it, some, sort of analogous to what Dan just said. We have staff in our Senate, and so they're in on some of these conversations. I also want to say that they were very important for planning. I mean, staff who do IT work, for example, who run payments and so on, absolutely critical to getting things done. Everybody in the budget office. But the other thing is, I would say even every single staff member, I mean, I can think about my own assistant and everybody's assistant, and, all the way across the board, we're absolutely critical to our success. Because certainly at the administrators where I am, we're so incredibly busy trying to figure out how to run the place and how to give everybody what they needed at this point. And the faculty were so crazed trying to figure out how to teach online and do this very fast pivot and then learn more about it over the summer. It was the staff, as usual, who kept the university going, actually. And so they had an enormous role to play. I do think that one interesting question is, again, thinking about the future, if you think about remote work policies, you can't really have one for faculty. I mean, in the sense that you can say, well, we're all going to be back. We're not going to be teaching online all the time. But everything they do for the other, 23 hours of the day has always been their business, and nobody, tends to bother them about it. For the staff, there's very serious questions now about how to address their needs and their desires at this point in terms of working remotely, which we've begun to do through a policy. But that's going to be very important on every campus.
Millie?
So what I've heard from our campuses, number one, of course, I agree with Susan that the staff is critical in running these institutions. And one of the things that I've heard is about HR, making sure that they understand, sending out information on where they can get support on mental health, where they can get support for tutoring their children. So they would have a whole list of things that they would send to staff so they could see that at home. The other thing is, Susan's right, there are people that had to be on campuses, but many campuses were alternating schedules so that people were coming in and coming out at different times. And so and then I also heard about for staff alternating mental health days, giving them a day off as the mental health day so that they can disconnect from the stress, because it was stressful for staff as it was for faculty, as it was for students. And then finally, what I'm hearing about the future is alternating how staff come in, where they'll take 3-2 schedules and change that over weeks. So as things start coming back, and also taking into account what people want to see in their lives. Many people have changed the way they want to live their lives into the future. And institutions are recognizing how extremely important staff are and how they can accommodate as much as possible things like a 3-2 alternating schedule.
Another question is about the new president of the United States. How has that shifted your planning, your thinking? Millie, why don't you go first?
Oh, my God, that's been such a difference. We are talking about students. We are talking about helping institutions. We are talking about educating the nation. And even as you look at all the relief money that's coming in, it is geared toward educating America. You look at the institutional grants, they're bringing out more money for grants for students. They're discharging, giving dollars so institutions can discharge outstanding debts if possible. They're looking for ways to help institutions re-engage students and allow dollars to re-engage those students that left and haven't been back. They're asking for mandatory outreach of the dollars to financial aid applicants and their recipients. I didn't see that those years that I was at ASCII, it was for. I came in during the Trump administration. I got none of that. In addition to that, the Department of Ed always calls the 6 together that represents each sector of higher ed to tell us what they're thinking, getting our input as they think about new policy. And they make themselves available because one of the staffers, Michelle Asher Cooper, is going to be on my webinar to talk about the Values Commission and what the administration thinks about it. All of that is extremely brand new. What a welcome time.
Dan, how does it look in Pennsylvania?
Well, I mean, I think it's nice to have an administration which, palpably cares about public higher education and understands the connectivity. Although, to be fair, I think that the past administration understood the connectivity with the workforce. That's a good thing. I think that the promise of financial support in a lot of the ways that Millie's just outlined, I think is also a good thing. I think there's some really difficult issues that we're going to have to face as a community. And I just pose them here without a point of view. But, there are, what happens if, this doesn't seem to me, the challenges we're facing, and it's actually true in the report that the Millie's group just put out, these challenges that we're facing cannot be solved on the revenue side. They just can't be. Money's important, don't get me wrong. Yes, please. But throwing money at this problem is not going to solve it. Just isn't. It's going to require fundamental transformative change in how we work. And so where's the accountability for the money? And there's some really challenging policy questions that are going to have to be addressed, and they haven't been addressed historically, in my view. Is that accountability at the federal level is, relatively speaking, weak. Underperforming, and I think there are issues of institutional readiness. Is every institution really ready to make that kind of transformation? And until it is, should we be investing in it? Because these dollars, I mean, unless we figure out a way to print them, I mean, I guess we've done that already, but I mean, they're not endless. Well, I mean, they shouldn't be endless. And so using them wisely is going to be critical. And I do think that there's another part of the conversation, so thank God. And at the same time, implementation details are really going to matter, because I would hate to be sitting here. You remember after ERA, boatload of money, most of it invested in just recurring operations. Very few universities, some did, obviously, in colleges, invested in strategic change. And then the moment passed. And God, I'd hate to see that happen again. I think that would be tragic. And frankly, I think that the starting point is so much lower today than it was in 2009. That I don't think we have the latency in the system to make that to make that mistake again.
Can I say something?
Sure.
It depends on what institutional readiness means, Dan.
Yeah.
Because there are some institutions that have the desire and the commitment, but don't know how.
Yep.
And then we put aside those who don't have the money nor the resources to be institutional ready. So we have to be careful with institutional readiness.
I agree, but we also, I mean, and I'm glad I'm not in the one having to do Sophie's choice, but this is a one-time opportunity.
I get it.
Accountability is a big deal.
I agree with you. I just want to make sure that we're not hurting the very.
Yeah, I agree.
We say we want to help.
Yep.
Susan?
Well, when you asked the question, I just started to write down a list. So here's my list. DACA. We have a bunch of students of DACA students who were basically living in terror for 4 years. That's seems to be going away. Just international students in general, that they're going to be not only able to come now with the pandemic hopefully receding, but they're going to be welcomed, and they're going to be able to get some visas maybe. The relief money, yeah, it's one time and it should not be wasted, but it's there and it's really helping a lot, especially the more recent one that we can use to sort of refund ourselves for some of the losses over the past year or two. Title IX is being addressed again in a serious way. Again, it's never been perfect, but at least we're going to get another shot at it. Funding science, that seems to be improving. And to some extent, there, you know, I sense there's going to be more support for state government, never enough, but maybe better. And I think overall, we're not going to be operating in our daily lives and our daily lives and trying to, you know, educate students of various backgrounds. We're not going to be operating in this context of racial, you know, divisiveness, which is what we were doing before. And no, I say that, at least not racial divisiveness that's coming from the top. It may be too late at this point that's certainly not gone away, but it's better. At least it's not coming from the very top anymore.
Those are all really good examples. Susan, I've got another question. What can institutions, faculty, and staff do to promote higher education as a societal good in light of rising skepticism? Susan?
Well, I mean, I think that this is why, you know, organizations like ASCU and ACE and APLU are so important, because this is something we have to do as a community and really figure this out. And obviously that, you know, that's some of what's going on already about how to talk about the value of higher education, and not just, you know, from how much you make in your first job or your first 5 years out of college. And it's deeply connected to the liberal arts education and creating a citizenry and a population that knows how to think about the issues of today. I think Millie said something about, you know, understanding basic civics and voting and so on. It's absolutely critical. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of what we have to do in higher ed now is pick up things that used to be done in high school and maybe even, you know, grade school. And I think that that's how we're going to show our value, by connecting these things and not thinking that we can do this through, you know, sort of very, you know, kind of rough data about money earned and, you know, and that sort of thing. And we've got to make the big argument. You know, there are a lot of ways to do it. I think on an individual basis, that's then got to be reflected at the local level in every single university in terms of how they communicate, not only with the public, but with the students and with their parents as well. So it's definitely an uphill battle. We have taken a lot of hits at this point.
Millie?
You know, Susan said a lot of it, but I would say that's what the report is all about. I mean, it also provides recommendations of what parents and students should be looking at. And this whole issue about the greater good, we've lost that battle and we've got to bring it back. And understanding that, yes, there are some of us that should have learned this in high school, as like Susan said, but there are new groups of people coming in to become American citizens who need to understand how democracy works and how they become engaged and become empowered to have voice. And so that is so important. It is really about, I always say this, it's about not only demonstrating through data, which is one of the things the Values Commission does, but it also talks about non-economic. So it's data and stories. You grab people's hearts when you hear the stories, the success, what our institutions are doing on a daily basis, how students are moving through and giving back, and also demonstrate the economic impact to our cities. You know, I have institutions like Dan spoke about, that if that institution was not in that city wouldn't survive. It's the economic impact of those who graduate and move on and have successful careers. It's about, yes, their lives, but it's also, as I said earlier, about our neighborhoods, our cities, our states, and our country. Because if we don't have the personnel to be able to come in and take over both the public good and the private good, they're gonna go elsewhere. And we can't allow human capital to be lost and opportunity for the country to be vital.
Dan?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have that much to add. I mean, it's an interesting industry, if that's what it is. We celebrate its diversity, and yet, its diversity entails a lot of competing products, if I can put it that way. And in this industry, the competition between the product, I think, ends up hurting all of our credibility with the public. And yet, at the same time, it's hard to know how to, move away from an environment where, we're in effect chasing scarce students and scarce resources. But somehow in an environment of scarcity, but also in an environment of plenty, institutional sectors will go after each other. And that I think that damages us. And I think it sort of promulgates these false choices, for example, between liberal arts and career-oriented education, between certificates and degrees, between traditional and non-traditional. So I'm not sure. I don't have a way through that. I tend to be increasingly interested in conversations about student-centered pathways, because they don't actually focus on institutions, they focus on students. Hey, there's a radical thing to do in education. And then about how institutions align around those pathways rather than how they, cordon off little parts of them for themselves. But there's a lot of there's a lot to do, because we have historically siloized ourselves. We fund ourselves in silos. Our regulatory environment is built in silos. Our accrediting environment is built in silos. And so there's a lot of stuff out there which reinforces our kind of distance from each other and our competition with each other. So it might be interesting to think about how some of the sort of stimulus money can be used in ways which get institutions to collaborate along pathways rather than to compete for student eyeballs, I guess.
And
Can I add one thing to that? Oh, go ahead.
Please.
we haven't done a really good job in talking to the public about the value as higher education, right? We've allowed the naysayers to take over the narrative. And that is why it's so important that now is a time to come out, because let's face it, you may be competing for students, but there's so many adults that need to have advanced education in order to take the careers that are out there today. We have to reinvent ourselves and also communicate to the public who elects everybody in these seats to understand why education is so important, and it's just not about the student. Sorry, Susan.
Susan?
I was going to actually take it. I agree with that. I was going to take another point that Dan made about the pathways, because I really agree with that. I think we have to be able to show the students and their parents how to get from, A to B, and how if you go through a really broad education, you're going to be better off in the long run. But I think the schools that are going to, I don't know about win, but have the upper hand in this competition for now a smaller number of students in college are going to be the ones that can also make those students feel that they belong there. And that I think this whole idea of belonging as the country gets more and more diverse and lower income in terms of who's in college, that's going to be absolutely critical. And in that sense, kind of going back to something much earlier that was asked about the sort of more elite schools who are not really included in the report, I think there's a huge leadership role now for these less elite schools, because they are the ones who have the experience in doing this. They have had to do this now for years. And, when Harvard lets in students that wouldn't necessarily have been let in 20 years ago, because they couldn't afford to go there, not because don't have the ability. The question for Harvard is, what in the world do we do with them now? Right. And there are many schools out there that have a whole lot of experience with that. And the leadership in higher ed, we need to make it kind of flip in that way, because that's where the real expertise that's going to be needed going forward is. It's in schools like UIC, like CUNY, like Penn State, and so forth.
Ask you institutions.
Ask you institutions.
In
Hofstra.
In light of the pandemic, what operational steps need to be taken by institutions to protect the health and safety of students, staff, and faculty? Anyone want to grab that?
vaccine? There's the one
That's
word.
institution specific, right?
Yeah, well, to require the vaccine, Susan?
I think so. I mean, I know that that's not possible. It's not possible right now in Illinois. I know that for the public schools. Seems to be possible in New York and California, kind of, and some other, New Jersey, I guess. But we require other vaccines. I just wish the FDA would move it along so that it was
I
just like
agree.
every other vaccine, because that seems to be the answer.
Other ideas, Dan or Millie?
No, Susan's on it. I think the vaccine is the answer for those states that are not going to go in that direction. They're going to have to bring in the social distancing and do all the things that we've been living through for a year or so, and do the testing and making sure that people are not getting COVID. There will be states that will not require the vaccine if it does become FDA approved. And so they're going to have to put in all those systems in place to protect the students, faculty, and staff.
Do you think that's different at an institution where the students don't live on campus? I ask because
I think you're coming in and out, so you could get it anywhere, right? And if you're living on campus and you go out to that party, you're going to bring it back. They're not going to stay on campus and do nothing.
Yeah.
When everyone was talking about, there were a lot of universities that changed their schedules last fall and even this spring, not having, ending at Thanksgiving and not having a spring break so that the students didn't start traveling and come back. The motto at UIC was every day is Thanksgiving at UIC. I mean, they all go home every day, or most of them go home every day. I mean, in normal times. And so in that sense, maybe there's a little bit of a difference, but, it just seems like such a shame because, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the mental health of our students. And even putting aside the real harm that this has done to so many students, just the average student who maybe isn't suffering terribly right now, they don't want to be in the basement of their parents' house. They want to be with their peers. And, the fact that we can't require this vaccine now, and as Millie obviously correctly says, there are going to be states that it doesn't matter, they never will. That's not good for our students. I mean, for their mental health and their need to be together. And it just seems like such a waste, really.
We haven't really talked about food insecurity and homelessness. And so many of our students are hurting.
Right. And they need us. They need to be on campus.
Absolutely. And they not only need our campuses, they need the community that our campuses give them. And it goes back to the number of individuals that they feel comfortable in having those conversations with.
And I think this goes to a point that Susan raised earlier. I mean, there's an opportunity here. We're going to our students really want to come back to campus, but what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that they really want to come back to? I'm not so sure entirely that it's sit in class or, do the things and are we going to be nimble enough to be able to use this opportunity to sort out what they really do need? And it's very individualistic too, right? And then to provide the range of options that we had to provide over the last year. I was looking at my date stamp and I realized that it was about May 17th, a year ago, that I realized at least, oh my God, higher education was designed to optimize for transmission in a pandemic environment. And we're all killing ourselves trying to figure out what to do about that.
We're out of time. I want to really thank Dan, Millie, and Susan for sharing their perspectives and thoughts with us. And I want to thank the audience for great questions. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
you.
Congratulations,
Nice to see you.
Susan. Good
Yeah,
luck.
have fun. Bye.
Bye-bye.